good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're zooming in from. It's good to see everybody. Shira Hecht-Kohler, who is our woman at 929. 929 is graciously hosting this book salon, is unfortunately not able to make it, but she does send her warm wishes. And I did just want to say a word about 929. I imagine that most of you know what 929 is, and you're here through hearing about this Beit Midrash and Book Salon through 929. But 929 is an innovative and exciting program, website, lifestyle of Tanakh study. 929 is the number of chapters in the Hebrew Bible. And if you have not yet checked out the website, strongly encourage that you do. If you are not yet signed up and kind of got to this through another means, if you want to hear about future gatherings, then please do sign up to 929 via 929, and the Beit Midrash and Book Salon will allow you to do that. So thank you once again to 929, and again thank you to all of you for joining and spending your Sunday discussing a very troubling, but I hope productive book. I also just want to say a quick word about what we'll be doing. I see a lot of familiar faces, which is really wonderful. But the name of this sort of gathering is the 929 Book Salon and Beit Midrash. We'll spend some time talking, debating about a contemporary work of fiction, and that's the Book Salon part. But we'll also synthesize that with a Beit Midrash, with a kind of, at least for the time being, virtual study hall. Especially today, I'm not going to be giving a lecture about various Jewish sources that I think could be put into some kind of conversation with this book. I really would like this to be an opportunity for all of us to learn together. I've kept sources to more of a minimum than I usually do. A lot of these sources are well known, some are not known at all, but I'd like the sources to kind of sit there, to be invoked, and then to hear from you what you have to say about these texts. So we usually, and let me, I apologize, let me introduce myself. I am the host of the Zoom, but I'm also facilitating the 99 Book Salon and Beit Midrash. My name is Shai Secunda. I teach at Bard College in Annandale and Hudson, New York. And I've been involved with 929, both through a bit of writing, but also particularly through trying to get a conversation going about popular culture and Torah study, especially Tanakh study, and seeing kind of what happens. So we have a nice crowd here. I really encourage you to say something, to speak as the conversation continues. At least as of now, I can see hands, but it might be actually preferable when you're ready to say something just to unmute your microphone. If you are not ready to say something, please do keep your microphone muted because there's so many of you. And I'd like to really start with talking about this book. First of all, has anyone ever read this book, this author before? Any yeses? Okay, so I'll say a word or two about the author. He is, I think he's becoming more and more known in the English-speaking public, but Yishai Sarid is, I think this is fourth or fifth novel that he's written thus far. He is the son of a very famous Israeli politician who recently passed away, Yossi Sarid, that was his father. And Yishai Sarid is a successful author, but he actually, sort of in his personal life, is a practicing attorney. He does this on the side. And his work is almost always, like the environment in which he grew up, politically charged. He's sort of trying to push buttons that are very sensitive in the Israeli context, but he feels need to be pushed. One of his other books that I strongly recommend, though I do not believe it is out yet in English, I think it will be, is a book called The Third, Hashlishi. And it is an attempt to kind of imagine a kind of biblical contemporary context for Israel that is quite powerful. For those of you who remember an earlier book that we read in this iteration, Muck by Dror Burstein, there are some similarities. And in that book too, he's really weighing in on very sensitive issues in the Israeli discourse. So I want to get your reactions, but just one other kind of piece of framing that I think is important. Of course, this book is quite provocative in the Israeli context, and we could talk about that as well. But I wanna elevate the conversation to think more globally, not just about Israel and the state of Israel, but actually specifically about Judaism, Jewish memory, and what this book means when we take it out of that immediate political context and put it into conversation with Jewish ideas. So let's get some. I'm sure this book got some reactions from you. I'd love to hear what people thought about this book. Don't be shy.
You're shy. We can't be shy.
There could be more than one shy, and I'm not shy.
By name only.
I'll admit that I haven't managed to read the book. But what I've read about the book, I think, is just, it's fascinating to me that I think in an Israeli context, making the claims that he appears to be making, it's a very different story than making that same claims in a North American context or abroad. And I mean, I think on the face of it, I do agree with him within an Israeli context, that the fact that the fact that diplomats land and go to Yad Vashem first, and the fact that all the high school kids go to Poland now, is on the one hand very successful, because there's a lot of Israeli kids who are afraid to death that this is going to happen to us, and therefore we have to, act in certain ways and defend the country. So it's probably good for supplying soldiers for the Israeli military and intelligence agencies. So maybe it's a good move. But on the other hand, I think it really does do a disservice to the original ideas of Zionism, and really to our ability to survive here as a country, since we're doing it based on this, maybe somewhat rational fear, but somewhat irrational as well.
Thanks for that, Meshulam. Any other comments? I'd love to hear, especially obviously the issues are charged politically, and you could weigh in on that, but also other issues as well. Reactions? Yeah, Marcia.
So I think I came to it perhaps from a completely different perspective, and not reflecting on Israel, the politics, etc. When I read a novel, I kind of start with, where is this going? Where am I going to be taken? And as someone who lost a significant amount of family members in Treblinka, it was very, very, very hard to read. It was very hard to read. Yeah. And I had no idea, where he was going, and I kind of left it, that was the way I just left the book. As you were talking, and I'm thinking, of course, differently and looking at perspective, okay, yes, I can see it, but I have to literally remove myself emotionally from the content to start thinking about other things. But that's the second gen legacy.
Yes, thanks for that. Other comments and reactions?
I also.
Go ahead.
Who?
Eileen,
I also found, I also found it very, very disturbing. I found the questions he asked, about passivity and how can you be happy when there's a Holocaust, deep, profoundly upsetting. But I live in Israel, and there's a joke. There's a explosion, a suicide bomber in a coffee house, and it's, the joke, and it's near someone's house. So the relative from New York calls up and says, "Oh, it's near your house. Is your daughter safe? I know she always hangs out there." And the mother says, "Oh, Kabul is safe. She's visiting Auschwitz."
Wow, that is a dark joke.
But it was all broiled up. It was a mess.
Yes, no, this was a really disturbing read, no doubt about it. Someone else was speaking at the same time as
I'd like to speak for a second.
Sure, yeah, Alyssa.
Hi, I live in New York, and my husband's family was from, my mother-in-law survived Auschwitz, my father-in-law, Bergen-Belsen, and I have twins who are 19 years old, and they spent a gap year in Israel, and they did that Poland trip last year, and I will never have an opportunity to go there. So for them, every time I read something in that book, it was very disturbing to me. But I put myself in their position, and they were those kids who were wearing those flags around the Israeli flags around themselves and davening and singing. So to me, gave me a very clear perspective of what they experience and what Jewish kids should experience if they can.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm sure many people have had experience either themselves or secondarily with the trip to Poland, whether Israelis or many North American and actually Jewish kids from all over the world do this trip. Yeah, Miriam, I see your hand is up.
I went through like a lot of different feelings with the book. I have to say that just to begin with, I love just with the opening pages, I thought it was going to be like this comic genre that I love. The sort of, has anyone read the book like Dear Committee Members, which is this book about this academic who is sort of having a nervous breakdown. So, it's this like epistolatory academic novel. So, the style that was chosen is this very contemporary style of how you write this book, I just thought it was like a very well chosen way to begin to tell it in this almost comic way to, the head of Yad Vashem, to whom he's so beholden, and, he's sort of the schlemiel who falls into Holocaust history for the stupidest reason possible. So it sort of gets you into it in this sort of crazy, semi-comic way. And, of course, that's not the way it unfolds, although in some ways it is the way it unfolds. And you kind of have all these questions of a contemporary novel about a man who's kind of self-absorbed and just falls into this path and is away from his family. And, we never quite find out what's going on with his son, and he has these affairs, and it's all kind of in the background in his very solipsistic way. So, that's kind of a genre I'm used to reading sort of for fun. So it's kind of interesting that happens. So that's sort of one little strand. And then this other strand is that I was thinking, and as Shai asked the question, I think I'm sort of, tend to be on the leftist side of things with Israel. So the question of these trips being, is there a point to them? And what do the kids get out of them? And once again, singing the songs and wrapping themselves in the flags, like that wasn't new or shocking to me. Like I've heard those questions raised in that discourse for a long time. And also the question of like, what does it do to you to be so immersed in Holocaust studies and be going there? And I thought that was really fascinating. But
yeah, just to kind of add something to what you were saying, Miriam,
right.
the question of the immersion with
Right.
the topic, in some ways and at some moments in the book, desensitizes him. That's what we would expect.
Right.
But actually, there are some moments where he talks about the very opposite taking place. That
Right.
his breakdown is a
Right.
result
And then I'm
of
saying,
becoming more and more raw. Yeah.
right. And then I'm saying, but to me, that's exactly what was so powerful. And the kids who learn, I thought who learn the lesson that that you have to be a Nazi.
Right.
To me, that was really the shocking part.
Yeah.
So what I was saying, as much as I feel like this kind of, oh, I know this discourse, that's where I was really shocked, and found the book shocking and powerful, and teaching. It's almost like when the particular gets to you. I myself almost felt desensitized, like, oh yeah, you go to Auschwitz, but what shocked me was like teaching your kindergartner that he has to fight back.
Right.
In some ways, to me, I mean, not really, because obviously I still am shocked by Auschwitz, but, on a very personal level, teaching your kid to be a bully was really shocking to me.
Right. Right.
Oh. Could I
Okay.
say something also?
Yes, there are lots of hands. Sure.
I just first of all, I didn't view this as fiction. I just viewed this as basically giving a lot of information about the fictional part. I didn't find so. It was just a scaffolding for basically what I viewed as I thought it very powerful, but because it basically showed how there's no good way of responding to to what happened there, and you just learn all the different bad ways of responding, all the different difficulties that you run into, and I assumed that most everything was factual, in terms of the way what happens there and so on. And even the thing about the Polish, the Polish. Having the army come and so on. If that exact thing didn't happen, then something similar happened, presumably. And anyway, all these responses seem to me to be, including his response at the end where he punches the guy in the face or whatever. These all seem to me to be natural responses, and none of them quite work to deal with this situation.
Yeah. Sarah, I saw your hand was up.
I guess this is can you get, oh, I'm unmuted.
Yeah, we could hear you.
Okay. This is it was kind of an interesting book for me. I'm a psychiatrist, so actually I read it in a, in a way of watching a person become more and more absorbed in a topic, more and more self-absorbed as that happened, going from being emotionless to really having the opposite, well, very self-absorbed, but to really having a mental breakdown after being so involved in all this stuff. I didn't know though how to explain the ending. I didn't really understand it, and maybe people have insights on that can help me.
I think we'll get to the end. And by the way, we do spoilers here because really you should read the book before you come. So I'm not going to hold anything back. I think Kelsey, you had your hand up, and maybe we'll just, if there's one more comment after that.
Yeah, I found the book extremely difficult to read. I find all Holocaust literature to be, extremely painful. My husband's family was there, and my children had a completely different reaction than apparently most teenagers. They did not want to go. They had several opportunities to go to Poland, and they said no. Going back there is something that should be avoided, not celebrated. I can't go there and sing songs. It's just too overwhelming. Even though their grandfather never spoke about it, the title of the book, The Memory Monster, really hooked me because it really is a monster. My father-in-law had nightmares till the day he died, and my children have nightmares. it's like an epigenetic thing that passed
Wow.
to them. And it's the memory monster really is something that is still with us as a people. You know, it's got its hooks into us, and we can't look at the world in any other way except as, how does this protect us from doing this experience again?
Wow. Wow.
You know?
Thank you for that. Yeah. Any other comments before we start digging into a few sources? Okay, so I'm going to do a screen share. If you want, Shira also sent out the handout a little bit before, so we can you can follow along that way. But it's the same handout, of course. Can everyone see that? Excellent. Okay, and I can't, in this mode, I can't see all of your hands. So if you have a question or a comment, just unmute yourself and say something. So I wanted to start kind of slow, less troubling, and think about our main character. Miriam referred to this. This really, I think, I agree, sort of almost comic framing, especially because it ends with a sucker punch of the employee accounting, giving account to what had happened to their boss, essentially. And this narrator, our narrator, is a historian, right? And again, right, as has been said, he sort of fell into this job by accident, and it's quite a discipline to fall into by accident. So I just have a little quote here that I'll read. I came to the dean's office and announced I was prepared to harness myself to the memory chariot, right? When he finally decided that this is what he would devote his academic career to, and ultimately his life to. That's how he puts it. So one thing I want to think about is what it means to be a historian within the terms set out by Tanakh and Jewish tradition. And I wanna just read one verse, one pasuk, and a relatively common way of understanding this pasuk, and put it out there, right? To wonder to what extent we can think of a historian in the Jewish and maybe even the biblical tradition. Okay, it's actually a pasuk that is given the titles of a number of works of Jewish history. So you might recognize in this pasuk a number of kind of classic works of Jewish historiography. And the pasuk is in the section of Sefer Dvarim of Deuteronomy known as Ha'azinu, right? It's a song that appears towards the very end of Sefer Dvarim. And the verse says, remember the days of old, give thought to the years of times past, ask your father that he may tell you, your elders that they may say to you. And the verse continues and describes how God, Elyon, one of the names of God, gives estates to nations and basically makes history happen, right? The word, I want to think about this word, and I'm sure everyone knows this within the context of the Holocaust. The word for remember in Hebrew is zachor, right? Zachor yemot olam, remember the days of old. And give thought is Robert Alter's translation of binu, right, or understand the years of times past, right? So there is, right, of course, in biblical poetry, there is a interesting relationship between these two parts of a verse. They're kind of synonyms, though sometimes a better way of thinking of them is kind of enhanced synonyms. Zachor parallel binu. And I want to read with you an explanation given by Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, a very important Orthodox German thinker of the 19th century, about how he understands this verse. It says here, remember, Zachor, the days of old. And not only this, but give thought. So he explains, descend into the depths of their meaning. try to understand the connections between the sequence of the generations, the generation of Adam, of Enosh, the generation of the flood, of the dispersal. Follow the stages of human development. So the first part of this pasuk, Hirsch understands, is essentially a call to understanding the movement of history, right? The connections between the sequence of the generations. Right? This was very important for Rav Hirsch to argue because this book was composed at a time, this really work of biblical interpretation was composed at a time where he was competing with other ways of reading the Bible, other ways of being Jewish, right? Intellectually Jewish, right? And he's trying to carve out a way of being intellectually committed, right? And also, as we'll see, connected to and subservient in a way to the tradition. And this sort of becomes clear in the way he understands the next part of the verse. And then ask your father, right? Ask your father about your history, that he may tell you. He will present it to you as it lives in his memory. Your elders, that they may say to you, the next part of the verse, your sages who have acquired wisdom and understanding, and they will interpret your history for you. They will explain your historical comings and goings in terms of sins and the educational stages of prior generations. So he adds that beyond the importance of descending into the depth of the meaning of history, which the pasuk, in his understanding, is obligating, one needs to consult with the elders to be able to understand religious issues, cosmic issues, sin, the causality of sin, the educational stages of prior generation. That's, one, we could call it modern Orthodox way of thinking about history, right? Trying to fuse these two things together. So I'm going to stop the screen share so I could see everybody. And I'm curious, first of all, if people have heard this interpretation of the verse in Deuteronomy before, kind of like a call to do the work of history, and what you might think of kind of how Rav Hirsch builds this relationship between descending into the depths of history and then consulting with the elders, sort of this religious desire to make sense of history. Because we're going to soon leave history behind and go to memory. Any thoughts on these psukim? Yes, Kelsey.
What immediately comes to mind is that you're not supposed to learn Torah without a teacher. It's the same with history. You can't just look at it from the outside. You need the experience of somebody who lived through it so that you can understand what it really means, not just the bones of the facts.
So he does. So Rav Hirsch is saying that one needs to consult with the fathers, right, to get that experiential. But he adds something even beyond that when he talks about the sages, right? The sages are not just people who are older. In fact, sometimes they're not. It's someone who has acquired wisdom. Actually, this is clear in Rav Hirsch's commentary. Zakein azeh shekana chachma. It's an old rabbinic midrash. So I agree that one of the emphases here is that history can't dwell just in hard facts. It needs the experiential. But he adds even on top of that, it needs someone to make religious meaning of it, right? In Rav Hirsch's account.
I have a comment. This is Diane.
Yes.
Along
please.
those lines, I'm thinking about how the narrator chose to just work with the facts, as you're saying, like, okay, how many people, where did they take them from? And he seems to have no guidance and no, what do you call the person who helps you with your doctorate?
Advisor.
Advisor. And then we're also presented with this director of Yad Vashem, who is also of no help and just removes himself and lets him go off in strange directions. With the only time he gives advice, it seems to be bad advice.
Yes, thank you, Diane. So That's actually an excellent point, which I didn't really fully think through, but I think is something worth thinking about here, right? On the one hand, right, true historical research, kind of the goal of it is not to accept the narratives that have been passed down, but to think about them critically. And this is, this is really one of the main banners of the craft of history, right? Of dismantling previous narratives and trying to really understand kind of a better explanation for the sequence of the generations. But at the same time, right, particularly when it comes to something like Holocaust history, when you're just sort of tuning everything else out, you want to know the numbers, you want to know, I mean, it's farce, but it's not. You want to know which tunes were used, right? As Jews were being marched to their death. There is a kind of, there's a profound disconnect between right, the facts and the body of the historical research and the way it dwells in the world. And one would imagine that perhaps, right, had he had a better doctoral advisor, right, maybe this story would have turned out differently. He has advice. He has those editors, weighing in, but they're kind of just, chatter in the background. He thinks he knows what needs to be done. So I want to move and now kind of move closer to the heart of the matter. Because really, even if you are a historian, and even if he is a historian of the Holocaust, he's a historian in the service of, yes, Yad Vashem is an academic institution, but it's really about memory, right? It's really about memory within the Jewish state, right? To try to I won't say make sense, but to try to work with the tools not only of history, but of memory to grapple with the Holocaust. Right? So memory, which in fact was the word, right? Remember, zachor, that was used in that verse that has been interpreted as the historical, banner, is in fact a much greater theme, detached from history, that I want to explore and really spend most of our time doing in the allotted session, thinking about memory and evil. And of course, I'm thinking of Amalek. Right? So many of you know the story of Amalek. Amalek is a nation that attacks, we'll read these verses in a second, that attacks the Israelites on their way out of Egypt soon after they've left. We're not going to focus so much, even though it's a fascinating question, about who the Amalekites were and what how we're supposed to understand why they attacked, the significance of the attack. What we're going to try to focus on is in the reaction, the Bible's reaction to that attack in terms of emphasizing the importance of remembering it, right? The reaction, the memorializing of it, and also the wiping out, right, of this people, right? So let's take a look at some sources here and think about them together. Oops, that's not what I want to look at. Let's see. Does everyone see the page again?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, excellent. Okay, so let's start with just a couple of quotes from the book that I pulled out. One is when he realizes that he's not really a historian, but his job is beyond that, right? She said, "You were impressed by my knowledge, but thought I lacked some emotion and personal attention to victims. I'm a historian," I thought, "not a social worker, but I promised I would take that into consideration and try to correct my ways." Right, this is early in the book after one of his, mistakes or one of his outbursts where he doesn't follow the script. And we'll talk about the meaning of not following the script. So that's one thing to think about, that the book also actually, places in front of us the distinction between the work of a historian and then the other things that are expected of a person in this position, dealing with such a gaping, enormous topic. Second, when he has one of the survivors come and also has a really troubling reaction to going back to the camps. He says as follows: "There was no point in trying to get him to say more. He had made his sacrifice to the memory monster." Right, that term that comes up time and again in the book, and of course is the title, right, of the novel. So let's look at the two main sections that outline the reaction to the attack of the Amalekites. One is in the book of Deuteronomy in Sefer Dvarim, and the other is in Sefer Shmot, the book of Exodus. And we'll look at these together. I've highlighted some words, but I'd love to hear what others make of it. So remember, right, that same word, zachor. Remember what Amalek did to you on the way when you came out of Egypt, how he fell upon you on the way and cut down all the stragglers with you, famished and exhausted. And he did not fear God. And it shall be, when the Lord your God grants you respite from all your enemies around in the land, that the Lord your God is about to take you in a state to take hold of, you shall wipe out the remembrance of Amalek from under the heavens. You shall not forget. Right? So remember what they did to you. And then when the Lord, right, gives you respite from the enemies in the land of Canaan, of course, you shall wipe out the remembrance from Amalek, from under the heavens. You shall not forget. So what do people make of this passage, and particularly the relationship between remembering and not forgetting on the one hand, and wiping out the remembrance of Amalek? I imagine some of you have thought about this before. These two calls. Yeah.
It's kind of interesting because it's Zachor Asher Asalecha. Remember what they did, but they themselves you shouldn't remember at all. So if you take it to the Holocaust, the Nazis, whatever you want to call the perpetrators, them we can not remember at all, but the act of what happened to us we have to remember. Which is kind of an interesting way to do history, right? It just becomes totally memory. What happened to us matters. The perpetrator, not so much. And that's why we should forget them.
So that's the way of sort of solving almost a contradiction, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Shalom is suggesting that, right? Yes, we need to remember what Amalek did, but not remember Amalek. Now, by the way, that's really interesting also in the terms of the book, because on the one hand, right, he's interested in the facts of the tragedy that occurred to the Jews, but he's also interested in, and he shows that there's a strange, troubling, almost magnetism that people have to the Nazis, right? So there's a discussion, for example, when he picks the cover to his book, right? And these are all good-looking, right? Well-dressed people, and they seem heroic. He tries to kind of, right? And he realizes the profound problem with, and the editor, obviously wants to do things differently, and yet he sort of can't stop himself. So that's a very interesting way of thinking about it. Is it possible, right? Is it really possible to forget about, Amalek, who they were, their heroism, just remember what they did, but really to wipe out, right, Amalek themselves? Fascinating. Other comments? And again, please unmute yourself if you want to say something, because I can't see everybody.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Who is this?
It's Erica.
Excellent. Okay, thanks.
So, I think there was a lot in this book that I think I've, as a second generation, I've thought a lot about. But the idea that the Germans, in some way, their machismo, their efficiency, I'd never thought about how easy it was to throw the Poles under the bus, but to preserve in some way. And I wonder, is there a relationship with Amalek that's that way? On the one hand, you hate them for attacking your vulnerable, But then when you become soldiers, you're also going to have to make some of those decisions. So is there some closet perverse reverence for them? And I think that came out in the book in a way that you see that the protagonist becomes himself a closet, like lover of that brutality, and then believing that narrative to in some way, oh, everybody wants to kill, right? It's just sort of politeness that's covering it up. So the brutality of it was really, very disturbing, because it felt true, and then it felt disgusting to feel true.
Yes, I mean that was definitely one of the most disturbing things that's explored in the book, and of course, a version of this question about whether either the Nazis were just sui generis and a kind of pure evil, or perhaps the opposite, entirely human, right, in their evil, is a question that has resounded famously in a debate, and a kind of excommunication of a 20th century Jewish philosopher, Hannah Arendt, and her phrase in her work on the notion of the banality of evil, surrounding this question, right? Are they us, or could we be them, or are they just really pure evil? So yes, deeply troubling. Maybe another comment before we go on to Sefer Shmot. One more. Again, I can't see everybody, so if you want to.
This is Kelsey.
Yes.
The part of the story that disturbed me the most was the kindergarten. Where the bullies in the kindergarten seemed to me to be paralleling the Nazis, and his son paralleling the Jewish people. And he goes in and he protects his son, but he doesn't teach his son to protect himself. And so at the end, when he's talking to the high school student who says, well, we have to learn to be like Nazis, it's like, is that what we're doing? We're teaching our kids to protect themselves from the bullies of the world, which is he was incapable of doing for his own son. That was the most disturbing thing. So it's like incorporating the Nazi, incorporating the Amalek within ourselves.
Yes, I mean that was one of the most disturbing and also very kind of strange aspects of this man's mind, of the narrator's mind. I mean, at the end of the day, those of us who have had children, we're familiar with ourselves, right? Are familiar with bullying. Everyone has had some experience with bullying, and it can be terrible, but it also is really part and parcel of what it means to grow up. And without belittling the problems of bullying, in his mind, exactly as you said, Kelsey, it really is, right? The Nazis are after his kid and gone. And, when he's pointing them out when his son is pointing them out and he's confronting them, you almost feel like, it's a trial. You take a step back because you're within his mind and you realize, wow, he's really, there's something really wrong with the way he's thinking. Let's take a look. Actually, before we go to Shmot, I wanna share one midrash that, as midrash is wont to do, closely reads this section, and understands how memory is not just something abstract here, but actually is concretized. We're going to see this even more in Sefer Shmot. So this is from Sifra on Vayikra. Sifra is what's known as a Midrash Tanaim, a Midrash that was composed by rabbis of the first, rabbinic period, Tanaim, somewhere around the beginning of the 3rd century. And this is how they read the repetition or the emphases in the verse. Remember what Amalek did to you. I might have thought remembering is just in your heart, right? When we think of the word remembering, and we haven't spoken about this yet, what does it really mean to remember? I mean, philosophers of the mind have spilled a lot of ink and for that matter, cognitive scientists, on the question of what exactly happens when we remember, right? So without kind of leaving that technical or detailed or complex question aside, right? Even just understanding the psukim here, or what we mean by remember, do we just mean remembering kind of internally, right, in your heart, right? So the Midrash says no, right? The emphases in this section tell you that it needs to be more than just a kind of internal memorize that you're remembering, right? Because yet when it says you shall not forget, then forgetting of the heart is already spoken for. How do I account for the word remember? That it should be ever on your lips, right? So in other words, when God, right, tells in Dvarim, when Moshe says that we need to remember what Amalek did to you on the way when you came out of Egypt, right? That's not just a kind of abstract remember it. Think about it sometimes. You need to speak it, right? You need to speak these words, and that's how one accomplishes memory. Now, in Jewish practice and in rabbinic texts, this is understood to be fulfilled practically in a number of ways. One of which is the Shabbat before the holiday of Purim, which is seen as commemorating a threat by and a victory over Amalek, and we'll get to that later. We read this portion in the synagogue. We speak it out loud, and in that way, we fulfill this need to remember, right, that it's ever on our lips.
Go down to the
Similarly, some people understand the reading of the Megillah, the Esther story on Purim, also to be a fulfillment of this need.
I wanted to say something.
Yes, please.
The situation of the pasuk. Oh, I'm sorry you took away the.
So I'll put it back. I just wanted to be able to see who was speaking. Here it is. Yeah.
When
I don't know where this is supposed to go.
Respite from all your enemies. In other words, when you're at a point in when you are perhaps in power or you're not the vulnerable one, perhaps. That's the point.
Where's this supposed to go?
What Amalek did to you, that you shouldn't repeat that for someone you shouldn't repeat that as an and I think
hold on, I'm having difficulty hearing. Just a reminder for people to mute themselves if they're not speaking. Yeah, one more time. So you were saying the verse, Nancy, is about what happens when you have power.
When you're the person in control, or you're the people who are in control, that you don't become like Nazis became, or like Amalek was, and attack or
well, it says just the opposite, actually. It says wipe them out. So, I mean, I don't agree with that.
No, you should wipe out the remembrance. Maybe
yeah, you won't remember them at all. They'll be gone.
So just to weigh in here, what Micah's saying is the, seems to be the simple meaning of the text. And in fact, in another text we'll read in just a minute, in the book of Samuel, in fact, this, there is a war against Amalek that specifically takes place because not only have the Jews conquered the land of Canaan, but they also have set up a king, the first king, Shaul. That's the moment when they need to actually wipe out the remembrance. However, there are, reinterpretations. We can call them creative reinterpretations, but ones that are kind of on the books, right, in Jewish writing, that say precisely this, at least from our vantage point in history, where we no longer perhaps know who Amalek is, right? The nations have shifted, that the way in which, this pasuk should be read, it's not a physical wiping out, but a wiping out of the remembrance. Now, your suggestion of reading this specifically when you have power, that you specifically should only wipe out the remembrance rather than the people, is really interesting, and worth thinking about. So thank you for that. Let's take a quick look at another really important expression of this idea in Sefer Shmot, which is sort of the actual account, right? Sefer Dvarim, Mishneh Torah is a recounting, and Sefer Shmot tells the story itself, so to speak. And after the story of the war, which I did not quote in its entirety, we have the following, right? The Lord said to Moses, write this down as a remembrance in a record, right? That's how Alter translates Ktov Zot Zikaron Basefer, right? Either in a book or in a record, and put it in Joshua's hearing, that I shall surely wipe out the name of Amalek from under the heavens. And Moses built an altar and he called its name Hashem Nisi, meaning the Lord is my banner. And he said, for a hand upon Yah's throne, war for the Lord against Amalek from all time. Okay. There's a lot going on in these psukim, a lot of interesting things. The spelling doesn't come through in the English, so if you do have facility in the Hebrew, it's worth looking, for example, at the way the word chair, right, throne is spelled unusually, or the name of God, which is Yah here instead of the four-letter name of God. These are, interesting points that I just want to draw your attention to. But I want to focus here again on the question of memory, right? And the need here, not just to remember. Perhaps as the rabbi said, that means saying it on your lips. But here to do two things, right? Put it down as a remembrance and record. So writing, right? Ketov, right? Write this down is part of the active memory. And also putting it in Joshua's hearing. Of course, Joshua is going to be the one to bring the Israelites into the land of Israel, into the land of Canaan, right? Moshe is not going to make it. And it'll be his responsibility for, right, as Nancy said, the moment when, they have power, when they're actually able to do this. And then finally, and then I want to hear some comments, we have this strange last pasuk that describes a hand upon God's throne, war for the Lord against Amalek from all time, right? The notion of all time, right? Some kind of eternity of this memory monster, this need to kind of not just remember it in your head or remembering it by reciting it, but writing it down, making sure people hear it, making sure that it will be wiped out. God will wipe out the name, and there it is, right, for all time. So comments on this? Yes, Kelsey.
It seems that what we're trying to remember is not the Amalekites, but their state of mind. We don't need to remember the Nazis, but we need to remember Nazism. The idea that the weak and the vulnerable are expendable and we don't have to do anything. It's just too bad. They can be allowed to be killed. I mean, even today, this is not politically correct, but I think about what Sweden did, allowing the virus to take out their elderly without doing anything about it, whereas other countries have tried to protect their most vulnerable people. And so I think it's that aspect of Nazism that we have to remember and not allow it to become part of our worldview, that this is okay.
Thank you. So yes, one of the ways that in Deuteronomy, Amalek's actions are described as specifically taking aim at the weak and the vulnerable. And just let me add one more thing. In view of your comments, it's a little bit philosophical, but again, when you're talking about memory, right, you're no longer talking about the thing itself, right? You've moved from the thing itself to memory of that thing, right? And once you do that, right, you're almost immediately launched into things like the idea of that thing rather than the thing. So, right, perhaps instead of remembering Amalek, remembering the Nazis, right, the whole goal of memory is remembering Amalekism, right, or Nazism, right, which is something worth chewing on.
And so if the Torah serves as our moral compass, and we can come to understand that the potential for Amalek is in all of us, and the Torah calls forth to protect the widow, the orphan, the downtrodden, et cetera, in remembering what humans are capable of and calling it out for what it is, and understanding that we individually, collectively have the potential to do same, and need to remember that that's not the way.
Yes. So another, thank you, Marcia. Another one of the ways that this is, that these psukim have been read, and again, it's helped by the idea of, memory, especially in Hasidic writing. So there's a famous passage in the Kedushat Levi that talks about, the internal Amalek, ideas that go back earlier in, Kabbalistic writing, but beautiful homilies on this idea. That's precisely how he interprets the contemporary way of fulfilling these verses. So thank you. So let's take a quick look at Sefer Shmuel. I just have part of this text. There we see, right, that sort of, originally, right, in its original context, and sounds like a cop-out, but in the interest of time, it'll be hard to kind of deal with the ethical issues. But the idea of wiping out Amalek was literal, right? Was quite literal. And in fact, right, this is how Sefer Shmuel presents this, that this was not about destroying the internal Amalek, right? Or doing all kinds of interesting ethical things with memory, but quite troublingly, profoundly troublingly, actually, wiping out the entire nation. So we can talk about, right, the problems, the theological problems that this raises, but I want to, just bracket that for a minute in trying to understand something that comes out from this section of Shmuel. And just to kind of explain outside, we have Shaul is the first anointed king. And again, this is a moment where they have power. Now they have power. And a message is sent from Shmuel, from Samuel, to Shaul, to King Saul, that the time has come, right? Thus said the Lord of armies, I have made reckoning of what Amalek did to Israel, that he said against him on the way as he was coming up from Egypt. Now go and strike down Amalek and put under the ban everything that he has. You shall not spare him, and you shall put to death man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Right? So the military order, right, comes from the divine to Shaul that now it's the moment where he needs to do battle. And in fact, in the section that that we don't have here, he does battle and he defeats the Amalekites. Right? It's actually militarily a resounding success. Of course, there's one problem, which Shaul doesn't admit to originally, and that is, and Shaul and the troops with him spared Agag, this is the king of the Amalekites, and the best of the sheep and the cattle, the fat ones and the young ones, everything good, and they did not want to put them under the ban, meaning they did not want to destroy them entirely as they had been told to. But all the vile and worthless possessions, these they put under the ban. Right? And ultimately, this is Saul's downfall. This is how Shaul HaMelech loses the kingship, loses the dynasty. It's all over because of this. And again, right, we can think about the theological questions that this raises, but I just want to understand within the terms of Sefer Shmuel, what's happening here. Now, one of the common interpretations is that Shaul did not show leadership. He listens, right? And that essentially, that's what, that's the argument that's made. He did not hold himself as the leader when the people wanted had this idea to spare the animals to sacrifice to God, right? Then Shaul gave in, right? So we could either say it's Shaul not fulfilling the orders, not acting as a leader. And that's, that seems to be the dominant way of understanding what's happening. But I want to understand it actually within the terms of this particular commandment of Amalek, of remembering and wiping out, I should say, Amalek. I think part of what's happening is that Shaul had the opportunity to end this thing entirely, right? Literally entirely, including the oxen and the sheep, the camel and the donkey. Right? And that's what he had been told to do, right? So he had been told this is the moment to kind of step out of that historical reality where there'll always be a hand against the throne of God. And one aspect, and this is one way of interpreting this passage, is that he didn't take the opportunity to end this thing for good. And because of these actions, right, in Jewish tradition, this enemy continued to rear its ugly head and threaten and destroy the Jewish people. Most famously, right, in the example of the Purim story, right? Haman is described as an Agagite, and traditionally this is read as a descendant of Agag, the king that had been spared, if only for a night, right? And in imaginative tradition, had procreated in the prison, right, that night, and they kind of ferried out the progeny. And even more to the point, right, at various moments in Jewish history, especially with Nazism, right, when pure evil is confronted and Jews suffer under that pure evil, this idea, right, rises again. And this is Amalek, which had not been, right, taken care of entirely. Right? So I think, right, the blotting out of the possibility of ending this, right, which Shaul did not entirely fulfill, seems to be part of what's going on right at this moment. Any comments on that section? Yes. Please unmute yourselves.
Hi, this is Kelsey again. Relating this back to, the Nazis, I always think about how difficult it has been for our generation to look at the information that Mengele and the other experimenters on human beings got about, human bodies and human health, and how difficult it has been for us to not blot that out, to not just say, well, this was acquired in horrific circumstances, we should not use it. And people saying, well, it's information, we should use it. So that particular example of the dilemma makes it easier for me to understand, Shaul and the people not wanting to blot out everything. I mean, surely there was some good here. We can, sacrifice the sheep to God and makes use of it. So, we have done the same thing in our generation.
Right. So in other words, whether there should be an entire, break, especially the intellectual issues, leaving aside that kind of extreme case with Mengele and his horrific experiments, there certainly has been quite a lot of angst about certain Nazi thinkers, Heidegger being the most prominent or infamous example, depending on your perspective, right? Whether a influential thinker like Heidegger should be ignored somehow, and that's kind of a way of totally separating this thing. So I want to think a little bit and kind of end our thinking with this notion of how what we are confronting is a kind of memory monster, right? This in the terms of the story, but also in the terms of kind of the tragic development of the story of Amalek and its after story, right, is a kind of monster. It consumes, right? It can consume people who are totally driven and again consumed by this desire to eradicate Amalek, to eradicate the memory of Amalek, right? Or to remember, right, at the same time what Amalek had done. This is how this man suffers, nervous breakdown. Now, I want to ask a question about the title. Who is, or what is, but actually who is the memory monster here? What ultimately is the memory monster? I mean, there's some hints in the book. I quoted a passage earlier where a sacrifice is made, right, to the memory monster. But who actually is the memory monster? Well, it's the narrator of the book. He becomes the memory monster, right? His son draws a picture. First of all, his son says, when it's explained why he's always absent, that he's off fighting, fighting monsters. And then he makes a picture of his dad. And then later, right, when he confronts that German who's making a documentary and is almost strangely a kind of like a soulmate of his, he picks up the dirt the same way and crumbles it in his hand. He's the only one who's really interested in all the details like he is, right? He's sort of confronted with a vision of himself as this memory monster, right? So, the question that we started with, and I think the most troubling question, unsolved question that the novel leaves us with, is really what can be done with the memory of Amalek? What can be done in this case with the memory of the Holocaust, right? It's easy to critique some of the ways in which the memory of the Holocaust is encountered, right? So, there are extreme examples, or even not so extreme examples. He says, do they have to sing Hatikva 5 times a day? Isn't it cheapening Hatikva to say that it's really, to completely joining it to the Holocaust? Those are easy critiques, right? The more difficult thing is, okay, right? So, perhaps there is a problem in the way that the memory of the Holocaust or the message that's learned takes over, right? Is monstrous, right? But what remains, right? Is there a possibility of redemption, right? Can something still be done? So I want to end, and then I want to get some more comments, but I want to end with a very unusual text. I often found that I only started learning the Zohar recently, and I often have found that because it is a profoundly irrational text, it's able to say things or present things that in like the normal, rational or Maimonidean strain of Jewish tradition is not possible to do. This has to do with a dream, actually, that our narrator has, but also the question that I'm sure many of you have confronted if you've ever traveled to these parts of Europe, of where, what if the ghosts, what if of these people, right, is still left there? And it's a very wrenching question that many of us feel in Europe, even if not at the camps, right? Even in walking in a nice, clean European city, right? All these Jews. So the quote from the book is, but wait, I said, what about all these people? This is a dream that he writes down where he's kind of brought into a minyan. And these are just essentially spirits of Jews that have never been rescued, right? I ran after him because the large iron door was beginning to close. We were both in a dark interior yard. What's going to happen to them? What about the others? I asked. They'll manage, he said. They have their hiding places. Shake your clothes hard, he said, and begin to speak the Kaddish prayer. So this is his experience with the ghosts. So I want to share a very strange passage for the Zohar.
Thank you for warming it up for me.
That I think says something about this topic, this problem. Here's the passage. Come and see, there are three voices that are never lost. Aside from voices of Torah and prayer, for these ascend on high and split heavens. But there are other voices that do not ascend, yet are not lost, and they number three. So these are the voices that are never lost. Listen to the list. The voice of a woman in labor when she is on the birth stool. That voice sweeps from one end of the world to the other. The voice of a human being when he departs from the world. That voice sweeps from one end of the world to the other. The voice of a snake when it sheds its skins. That voice sweeps from one end of the world to the other. Now, when this secret is given to Rabbi Shimon, he responds as follows. O holy pious one, how great and precious is this matter. Now, what happens to these voices, and where do they enter and settle? These voices are of pain, and they go flying through the air from one end of the world to the other, and they enter crevices and holes in the earth, and are hidden away there. When a person raises his voice, they are aroused by that sound. Now, ostensibly, the text is talking about its kind of unscientific approach to echoes, right? Why is it that when you stand in a field and you yell, you hear a voice comes back, right? But the text is doing a lot more than kind of trying to explain a strange natural phenomenon, right? It's trying to explain what happens to the voices of these moments of birth and the moment of death, right? Voices of pain, right? What happens to them? And the explanation is when a person raises his voice, they are aroused by that sound and sort of can be, if not recovered, at least heard. Now, the third voice, this is what the text has to say. The voice of a snake is not aroused by a person's voice. How is it aroused? By striking. When a person strikes a blow, the hidden voice of the snake, you remember the snake makes a sound when it sheds its skin, is aroused towards that sound and no other one. Sound arouses sound, kind to kind. Consequently, in the day of Rosh Hashanah, the sound of the shofar arouses the sound of the shofar, kind following kind. The snake inclines to evil to strike and kill. The voice of the snake is aroused only by its own kind. So the text is quite literally a mysterious text. The text is interested in what happens to these voices, not just of pain, but of cosmic pain at the moment of birth and at the moment of death. And the notion is that one can, if not resurrect these voices, one can tap into these voices, hear these voices by speaking, right? So in a way, right, I think that if, things are done correctly, speaking the voices of pain, speaking the voices of the Holocaust is not inherently monstrous, right? That's not the monstrosity. Right? That's the way in which somehow, it's not redemption, but somehow these voices which, of pain, which travel the world can be invoked. Now, the strange, and this is a passage that we don't have the time to go through all of its details and why these three are together. But the voice of the snake, right, of course, is a negative voice, and it is aroused by violence, right? So as opposed to the voice of birth and death, which have a human quality, the sort of snake is only brought to life by violence, right? So the idea of this passage in the Zohar, right, has to do again with the recovery of dead voices, and the idea that when one speaks humanly, right, one can somehow reinvoke these voices, bring them into a space to be heard. But when violence is part of the picture, right, then you get these kind of demonic, right, snake-like voices, which of course nobody wants, right? So this isn't a solution because I think the point of the book is that there are no easy solutions, certainly of how to do Holocaust education, right? But the text does speak about the possibility of human voice recovery and the dangers of the kind of demonic voice recovery. So I'd love to get either thoughts or comments on that text, that very unusual text, or kind of, since we're concluding now, comments on other passages or on the book in general.
You wanted to talk about hitting the face, so the hitting the director. So
I'm
hoping
yes.
you cover that.
So, I mean, I'd like to hear what others say, but the moment at the end of hitting the director is a kind of, obviously it's a cathartic moment, but it's the moment when the narrator realizes, right, not just that he's been played, but he confronts the memory monster. He realizes that he's being manipulated. By the way, just like we as readers, right, are kind of like the same camera of that German. We're watching this whole thing take place, right? We see this Jew who's there. He's a tour guide. He's having his nervous breakdown. We too are sort of, it's a kind of postmodern, fiction move. We too are part of the spectacle, right? And he punches the German. He punches us. I was shocked, right? I felt a punch in the face, but he's also punching himself because he realizes that the German and the reader, right, is engaged in the same thing that he's doing, right? This kind of work with memory, this construction of memory, needs to be defeated because it's monstrous. That's my reading, but I'd love to hear what other people made of this or other comments.
I wanted to say that the bit about the snake, I had always been taught that the snake and Amalek are very connected. So this was a very interesting quote there. I was also not that sure about the end, but I think I'm reacting a little bit of a different way. I thought that not that he realized he was being played, but that he realized that this guy was a Nazi. His motivations were Nazi, and everything that we've kind of been led to of Israel's overreacting to the way we're addressing the Holocaust, we're teaching our kids to be Nazis, we really have to readjust because we're losing perspective. And in the end, he says, we're not really losing perspective because there's anti-Semitism and here it is, and we have to fight it. And I wasn't sure if that was a way to read it or my own sense of.
It's certainly a way to read it. It's certainly a way to read it, right? He is confronted with a real, right, live, flesh and blood anti-Semite, a German one no less. So yes, I think that is definitely a reading. Other comments or thoughts either at the end or Kelsey?
That passage from the Zohar really brought back to me the part of the book we didn't discuss, which was the creation of the video game about the Nazi in experience. That in particular is a way of capturing these voices so that they never disappear. I mean, the books we're reading now, a couple of generations, they'll be gone. But a lot of times, you capture it in a video game or something like that, and it's there forever.
In a way, yes. I mean, that seems to be, what was motivating them. But of course, I think there's a strong critique of the idea that somehow this virtual simulacrum, of the experience will do it. And he gets the people, the programmers, to basically admit that this is a for-profit enterprise and it's a game. For me, it was a very deeply troubling moment. But we shouldn't necessarily discount the possibilities of virtuality. There's been studies about how empathy, even for places and people suffering in places around the world, can be experienced by virtual reality. I see Nancy has a comment.
But just before we get off of that, the video game developers wanted to put in like 3 characters, which relate very clearly to the 3 voices in the Zohar, the voice of death of the prisoner, and the voice of the snake of the Nazis. And then the voice, I guess, of the capos was like, somehow intermediate, more like the voice of the pain of trying to
Interesting.
live of the mothers giving birth.
Interesting.
So it
Thank
seemed
you.
very parallel.
Yeah, thanks. Nancy.
I just before I say my comment, I was very troubled by that video game. It was viscerally horrifying
Yeah.
for me.
Yeah.
I wanted to just say something about the Zohar piece, the snake, or the three voices were of grand kind of transformations from not being alive to being alive, or being alive to dead, and then the shedding of the skin feel like a true transformation of a something, of a person. And so I can see the connection there that people have said to Amalek from the snake. But I think that it's maybe, or my first reading of when a person strikes a blow, or when there are moments of conflict, of not conflict, of a striking from one to somebody else, from a strength to a weaker. That's when you hear the voice of the snake. And maybe it's a reminder to that these kind of situations, small individual and nation to nation and people to people, will crop up. And the voice of the snake reminds you that transformation or that ugliness is something we have to deal with.
Yeah. Thank you. And just to sort of very quickly add, another connection between those three sounds, of course, is the curse in the book of Genesis. And that's actually kind of another version of that passage in the Zohar, is in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, kind of late Midrash, where that connection is made. So, you have the curse of birth, of pain in birth, I should say, mortality, even though in that section of Breshit, the main curse of Adam is, by the sweat of your brow shall you live. And then, of course, the snake is cursed, not by shedding, but kind of being this creature. So that's sort of another aspect. But I love certainly what you said is very much present there. The kind of these moments of transformation, existential transformation in terms of life is there. Maybe one more comment, because we're out of time. If there are comments, last thoughts. So maybe I'll just leave with one. I don't know if it's positive or comforting, but one comment I didn't put on the handout that you got in advance, but I did add it just a few minutes ago, also from the Zohar. And the idea is that humans, right, are being asked to do their part in erasing the memory of this evil. But ultimately, right, the true evil will only be taken care of by God, right? This is kind of learned from the difference between the way it's presented in Exodus and the way it's presented in Deuteronomy, right? And in Deuteronomy is you shall wipe out the memory, but in Exodus it is I God will wipe out the memory. So ultimately, right, there are no solutions, I think, for how to fix the problem of the memory monster. But there is, I think, a message that one does what they need to do with confronting this memory, with dealing with it. But ultimately, right, it's up to God to sort of, if not rectify, at least make this evil even disappear from on high. Don't know if that's redemptive, but at least it's a bit comforting in terms of telling humans, do what you need to do, but God will deal with the truly cosmic proportions of the memory monster. So thank you so much for joining and participating, and all of your amazing comments. Please stay in touch. We hope to do another book within another 6 weeks or so. As always, feel free to send suggestions. I'll put my email in the chat if you do have suggestions of things to read. I think we're going to do something a little lighter next time, because the last couple of books have been really, it won't be lighter and intellectually lighter, but I think it'll be hopefully something a little more uplifting. And I hope to see you in another month and a half or so. So stay healthy, everybody, and stay well, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.